Divided nation. Is race killing America? That's our topic today on Quadriga. Welcome. Race relations in the U.S. are at their lowest point in decades. A majority of Americans say they're bad and getting worse. Last week, the divisions widened once again with renewed incidents of white police officers killing black people. That triggered mass protests and retaliation. The shootings in Minnesota and Louisiana were recorded on cell phones. Afterward, protesters took to the streets across the country, accusing police of racism. At a demonstration in Dallas, a sniper fired shots at police, killing 5 officers, wounding 9 others. President Obama played his now familiar role of mourner-in-chief this week, calling on Americans of all races to come together as the people of Dallas had done. How deep are America's divisions, and how can they be repaired? That's what we want to talk about this week on Quadriga with 3 guests who are following events there very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Eric Kirschbaum. He's a New York native and longtime Germany correspondent, currently working with the LA Times. He says the United States feels like a powder keg with deep political, economic, social, and racial divisions threatening to erupt into a bigger explosion. And it's a pleasure to welcome Rika Havertz. She's a senior editor at Site Online, and she has also reported from the U.S. for the daily newspaper, The Tats. She says American society has failed to address the issue of racism for years. President Obama has to ask himself if he's been too defensive in making this his agenda. And finally, a pleasure to have Karen Taylor on the show. She's an activist with the Initiative for Blacks in Germany. She says more black people will be killed as long as racism is rooted structurally and institutionally in our society, and that applies to the United States as well as to Germany. Karen Taylor, what is your reaction when you see a video like the ones that showed the killings last week? And are you convinced that, in fact, we're seeing an increasing frequency of such incidents?
Definitely, definitely. My first reaction was anger, and of course sadness because people died. But I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by this development because we've seen a structural deniance, a structural negotiation of racism in the United States, but not only in the United States, as well as in Germany, as I just pointed out in my beginning quote. So I think as long as this structural problem isn't tackled, we will see more people die.
Eric Kirschbaum, similar question to you. Would you say, in fact, there are more such incidents now than in the past? Racial violence in the U.S. is, of course, by no means of recent origin. But do you think we are seeing more such police shootings, or are we simply seeing more reporting due to the ubiquity of cell phones?
Well, it feels like there's more police shootings of black people taking place right now, but it probably is more of just a coincidence that more people are filming these things, that people are all over the place with cell phones. It's just still a horrible trend, and it's a scary trend when you think about how lesser incidences led to enormous racial unrest in the 60s and in the 90s, 50, 60 people being killed all the time at these kind of racial unrests, and yet nothing of that scale has happened yet. So it's a bit scary. It is a dangerous situation, and the United States is a powder keg right now.
Rika Havertz, speaking of powder kegs, one could see in the video of the shooting that took place in Minnesota a very, very tense police officer, very, very on edge. Can we really be sure that these are incidents of endemic and blatant racism as opposed to simply fearful, overburdened, badly trained police?
I think it's a lot of, to your question, a lot of answers lie in different areas. I think there is racism, and there are numbers that show that our white police are more likely to kill African Americans or use violence against African Americans, but also police is not well trained in the U.S. I think from state to state this differs, but for example, in Chicago, you can be trained for 12 weeks and then you're a police rookie on the streets with a gun. And then, of course, there's a third issue, and that is the amount of guns that are out there in the country. So I don't even blame police officers to be very afraid that they'll be attacked at any minute, because there are approximately 300 million guns out there in this country. So you cannot be sure. But of course, the issue of racism needs to be addressed.
Karen Taylor, you said in your opening statement that racism has deep structural roots both in the U.S. and here in Germany. Yet, in fact, if you look at the statistics on such shootings, last year in Germany, 7 people were killed by police. This year in the U.S., it's already over 500. Now, even accounting for the very big difference in the populations of the two countries, that's a staggering discrepancy. Is it then as much about guns and some kind of pervasive culture of violence in the U.S. as it is about racism?
I think it's about both in the U.S. It's more about racism in Germany. If we look at the statistics, as has just been pointed out, police violence attacks more black people than white people compared to the population. So I think the issue here is not wanting to face the structural discrimination within the police because of fear of offending them, because of the fear of pushing them away from the issue and rather than to work with them. So the offenders in this case become the victim. Because if we call them out as racists, they feel hurt and offended at that point. And that I think that's a huge issue.
Eric Kirschbaum, structural violence within police forces has been a topic for the Justice Department under President Obama. They've done a number of civil rights investigations of police departments, concluding that a number do, in fact, have entrenched structural problems. Is that making any difference? We're not seeing this problem abate.
No, but every city is different in America. Every community is different. I mean, the Dallas Police Department, for example, is exemplary for working with the different minority communities, and it's
now
ironic.
Headed by an African American, of course.
So Dallas, ironically, was where this horrible incident happened. But there is a lot of racism in the police departments in a lot of cities in America. And as you mentioned, the police aren't really trained that well in America. The average training is 21 weeks in the United States. In Germany, it's 3 years. In Germany, there's a lot more training that the police get with law enforcement and the legal implications. In the United States, they're pretty much thrown out in the streets. The police in the United States also have this secondary job of traffic control. In Germany, there's a whole agency that takes care of that, makes sure the cars are running up to order. In the United States, the police in these local communities are out there trying to earn money for the local police department by stopping people. And if they see a black person driving in a white neighborhood, they're more likely to try to find something wrong with that car to raise money for the community. So all these things are coming together, and it's really an explosive situation.
And I think one more part is to that, what you just mentioned, is that police for the longest time in America has been such an sacred thing, and they were untouchable, and they're heroes, and nobody was like, everybody is like saving themselves from being blamed for anything, and it was just such a tight-knit community, the police force, that nobody was ever to blame for anything, and they were untouchable, and I think that needs to change as well. They need to be made responsible for what they're doing.
Studies, in fact, show that black and white Americans now have entirely different views of the police. I saw a statistic doing the research for this program that showed that 80% of white Americans say that the police are serving their communities well, whereas a majority of blacks see their service as fair to bad. In other words, to many Americans, it appears that the American dream isn't working for them.
In the U.S. last year, 5 times as many young black men were shot and killed by police as were young white men. African Americans make up about 12% of the country's population, but more than 1/3 of all jail and prison inmates. Despite the gains made in civil rights over the last 6 decades, many blacks can't find jobs. The unemployment rate for African Americans is more than double the rate for whites. Even blacks who earn a college degree are almost twice as likely to be out of work than their white counterparts. And African Americans still have a shorter life expectancy than whites, a little over 75 years for blacks and 79 for whites. Does the American dream apply only to white people?
Karen Taylor, that was a snapshot of a moment in time now, comparing black to whites. But what if we look over time at whether things are changing for the better or the worse? When you look at young African Americans today, would you say that their lives, in terms of discrimination, in terms of racism, in terms of opportunity, are better or worse than those of their parents?
if we compare it historically, their chances are definitely better than in the past, no question. I think we can all agree on that. But if we compare blacks to whites or to other minorities in the US or in other parts of the world, this structural injustice hasn't changed compared to the other groups. And that's something which has been pointed out by the United Nations, for example, which claim that black people or people of African descent are the most targeted, the most vulnerable group within minorities in different states of the world. So, which has led, for example, to the UN decade for people of African descent, where countries are obliged to enforce or ensure that racism is been tackled. So I think definitely there's an improvement there, but the injustice compared to the other groups is still there.
But the U.S. has an African-American president, and Black American families can now say to their children, you can be president, and they can mean it.
And that's definitely a fact which empowers black people everywhere. But he, as a person, can't change the system. He can only be a symbol. He can enforce law-making as well, but he can't be the factor which would change a whole society.
I want to come back to Obama's role in just a second, but Eric Kirschbaum, we are now coming up on the American presidential nominating conventions, and you keep telling us the situation is explosive. In Ohio, the state that will be hosting the Republican convention next week, open carrying of long guns is actually permitted. Now, we're hearing groups, including a newly reconstituted Black Panther group in the U.S., saying they definitely plan to protest at those conventions. Do you think we could see outright racial violence in the context of the conventions?
Considering Trump's campaign has had a racism overtone to it since the beginning, there's going to be racial tension in Cleveland, definitely. And I mean, you're right. We live here in Germany, and it's hard to imagine a convention of a big party and everybody's going to be allowed to carry guns in a city. It's amazing. And every time in the United States, I'm always freaked out when I hear all the people are carrying guns under their suits. And it's as you mentioned, there's 300 million guns in America. Everybody has a gun, just about, and it's just a really dangerous situation.
Rika Havertz, you covered some of the primaries, I know, and undoubtedly, like many journalists, you've been somewhat astonished to see the rise of Trump. Many people say that Trump himself reflects the increasing primacy of identity politics, of divisions in the U.S. Do you think that's right?
I would agree with that to some extent, because I think that Trump solely bases his campaign on making the division in the country greater, and that he is not the one who talks to a lot of groups of people. He's not someone who talks about diversity. He's someone who plays with the anger of a lot of angry, white, middle class, lower middle class, middle-aged men mostly, that are, I think, frustrated because they feel, as a lot of other people in America feel, the American dream does no longer work for them. There's no longer the one job you keep, the house you can buy, the car you can keep, and the kids you can send off to college. That's all gone, and they think that Trump is someone who can bring that back. I don't think he will ever bring that back because times have changed, but he appeals to that group of people, and of course, he appeals to them saying, well, I can bring that back for you, but so of course they're angry at every other person who might take that away from them.
And Trump appeals to the angry white man who's lost some income over the last decade or so, but he forgets that blacks have lost twice as much income as the whites that he's appealing to. There are other minority groups in America that are doing a lot worse than the white middle class, and Trump doesn't really seem to make any effort at all to integrate minorities into his voters.
Absolutely, but also the Republican Party is part of the problem, I would say. I mean, it's so easy to say, well, Trump is the worst, and he is probably, but the GOP has been very good as being racist against President Obama. They've been very ideologically on him the past 8 years. So, I mean, they took their part in fueling this anger, and I think they need to think about what they need to change, because it's still very more likely for a young African-American male to be shot on the street than to become president of the United States.
Karen Taylor, there was a lot of discussion this week in the aftermath of the Dallas shootings of police officers that we saw in our opening report about whether Black Lives Matter, the movement that has evolved, particularly among young Black African Americans, to try to reclaim their own cities, whether that movement is making things worse or better in terms of creating this atmosphere of identity politics. What do you think?
I think this civil rights movement is an important movement because, on the one hand, it shows as a group that Black people face this racial discrimination, which leads to deaths of hundreds of Blacks. So, on the one hand, they group all this information and just put it out there for people to see and for people not be able to ignore what is happening. And on the other side, they tried to find a dialogue with President Obama, for example, which happened yesterday. So it's not just an anger movement or a movement which just wants to be out on the streets in order to demonstrate, but also to come up with new solutions. And
there is a lot of anger, though, with Black Lives Matter, and the civil disobedience is causing tension. The governor of Texas blamed Black Lives Matter for the Detroit shooting. I mean,
for the Dallas shooting?
For the Dallas shooting. It's not purely a peaceful movement. There is civil disobedience involved as well.
I think there's a tipping point at this moment because whites in America look at the Black Lives Matter movement way more critical than African Americans. I think that's just a recent New York Times poll that just came out. And I think so for the movement...
Just a statistic on that, because it is quite interesting. Something like 37% of whites say Black Lives Matter can make a positive difference, whereas a vast majority of Blacks think that it can make a difference.
So I think for the movement, which I think is good that it's existing because it shows that there's something wrong and that you need to address racism in the American society. But I think it's a very important point for them right now to be smart about the next move and to be not...
nonviolent.
Yeah. But on the other hand, the media has to play its part as well because it is a non-violent movement. They have never called for guns or have never called the people for violence. That the Dallas shooting, I wouldn't put it in the same group as the Black Lives Matters. It's an individual which has definitely overstepped or definitely done the wrong thing here, causing this amount of deaths. So. But he's not part of the Black Lives Matters group, for once, and they have never claimed him to be part of him on the other side. And they've communicated in a very peaceful way. Yes, civil obedience, yes, but not with violence. And now it's up to the media how they portray this movement as well.
As you mentioned, President Obama met with Black Lives Matter, and indeed throughout his term in both terms in office, race relations have been a test for him. Things, interestingly enough, looked very, very different when Obama came to office. At that time, a majority of Americans were optimistic about race relations, and some even talked about a post-racial America. Last week, again, Obama found himself back in the role of mourner-in-chief. He went to Dallas this week and called on Americans to try to find unity amongst themselves. But many Americans found themselves asking, to what avail?
In this, the last year of his presidency, Barack Obama has often tried to calm an increasingly divided nation.
We must reject such despair. I'm here to insist that we are not as divided as we seem. And I know that because I know America.
But the president knows that for many Americans, words are not enough. In the wake of the recent shootings of young Black men, many in Afro-American communities across the country are demanding that President Obama take a clear stand. When Obama first took office in January 2009, he represented hope and change for lots of Black Americans. But many now feel that the president has let them down. Has Obama done enough to fight racism and improve the lives of African Americans?
Eric Hirschbaum, are you disappointed? Would you say Obama could and should have done more?
I'm disappointed that America is probably more racist now than it was 8 years ago. I was one of the optimists who thought that this is a whole new era. And it's been sad to see that there seems to be a lot more racism in America than I thought there was, and it's only getting worse. But I think Obama has tried very hard. I think he's done everything he can to combat racism, and I think he's done the right things.
Karen Taylor, Obama had the entire Republican Congress against him from the beginning. He had overtly racist statements made by a number of representatives in both houses of Congress. If he had been more decisive and more confrontational on race issues, isn't it possible he could have made the divisions worse rather than better?
First, I wouldn't agree that the U.S. is more racist now than it has been 8 years ago. And then to your question, I think, well, as for me, I'm disappointed as well that he didn't make the positions, or he wasn't that clear on how he stands on racial discrimination. But I get that in the system where somebody who was pointed out as a racist becomes the victim, it is very difficult for him to not offend the majority or to push the majority away. So I get that he was in this dilemma of how do I stand and how do I make my points clear, because as a black person, he has definitely faced racist discrimination as well. So even from his personal standpoint, he could have made a change by just pointing out what he has faced and what he is still facing.
But in fact, Rika Havertz, didn't he do that? He gave one speech in which he talked about the fact that I've been that man who crosses the street and hears people locking the doors of their cars. I've been that man who gets in an elevator and sees people clutching their purses to themselves. I've been that man who, if he had a son, would be having to have the talk with him about the potential for violence. So he has, in fact, done that kind of talking, and furthermore, 20 investigations by the Justice Department. I'm saying this to you because in your opening statement, you said he could have done a great deal more, but are you sure he really could have in the political climate that he faces?
Well, I'm agreeing with you that it's been a very big dilemma for him, and he had his moments. He gave great speeches. He was over and over again forced to give that speeches because of the violence, because of the incidences we saw. He walked across the bridge in Selma saying this has been remembering 50 years of civil rights movement. So of course he had his moments, but I think that he was very eager not to appear as a black president. He wanted to be the president of the United States, and I think he should be just that, the president of the United States. But the past 8 years showed that maybe at some occasions he should have been more a black president.
But very early he was critical once of a Boston policeman who did beat up a black guy, and he was attacked by that from the whole country because it just was going to worsen relations probably, and he did the right thing. He had a beer with that policeman then, and he tried to...
And with the black guy together. Yeah. The black guy happened to be a Harvard professor who was trying to get into his own house.
Right.
The Boston police came and tried to stop him.
But you saw the reaction just to that. Obama said, you know, you can understand that. That's ridiculous. And it led to a big discussion in the United States, and I think Obama realized he doesn't want to exacerbate racial tensions, and ever since then, he's like his speech in Dallas. He's tried to heal the wounds.
But let's talk. Sorry, because we're very close to the end of our show. Let's talk very briefly about how to heal those wounds. The United States, its motto: "E pluribus unum," out of the many, one. Certainly, that's not what we're seeing right now. What has to happen? How can we change the situation? Karen?
I think Obama has done the right thing by saying we need to communicate more. I think that's a huge issue, that we are talking about people who are afraid of things which don't exist because of their biased thinking. So at first we need to get everybody on the table and talk about the issues and address the issues, and not just push them away and say, well, but we are doing our part, so why aren't you? I think that's an important first step.
Rika?
I think there are a lot of answers to that questions. I think we need to talk more. I think you need to change policies. You need to change social injustice that still exists. You need to prepare better for educational equality for all people in the American society. I think you need to have stricter gun laws to decrease the number of guns out there so that police officers that hopefully are better trained in the future are not afraid to walk in front of a house because they're afraid they might get shot. And I think we just need to address diversity. Chicago, for instance, is a city. There's not one neighborhood where it's truly diverse neighborhood. They all live in different neighborhoods. So let's create a neighborhood that is diverse and have a beer.
Eric.
I think the election results could be very important. If the parties that are racist and appealing to that get clobbered in the election, that could be a very strong signal for reuniting the United States.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.